At 3:14 in the morning, nobody on the flight deck of a NATO carrier was expecting the night to turn lethal. The sea was black, the air was cold, and off the edge of the formation, a Russian surveillance vessel that had spent days pretending to be just another intelligence collector made a move that changed the entire temperature of the encounter. A drone came off its deck and accelerated into the dark. Small target, fast closure, minimal radar signature, no warning call, no signal flare, no attempt to explain intent. Just a compact aircraft-shaped object driving straight toward one of the most politically sensitive targets in European waters. Inside the Combat Information Center, there was no time for philosophical debate. The question was brutally simple: was this a surveillance probe or the opening move of an attack designed to cripple a carrier's deck before dawn? Because at that distance, even a small explosive payload could do outsized damage. It would not need to sink the ship. It would only need to tear through exposed aircraft, ignite fuel, or force flight operations to stop. On a carrier, that is enough. You do not always disable naval power by destroying the hull. Sometimes you disable it by choking the deck. And that changed everything. What made this moment so dangerous was not the drone alone. It was what the launch meant. Russia was no longer testing boundaries with lights, lasers, or harassment. This looked like a deliberate attempt to trigger NATO's defensive systems, expose their reaction chain, and collect the electronic fingerprints of the fleet in real time. In other words, this may not have been a strike meant to kill. It may have been something smarter. A provocation designed to force a carrier group to reveal how it sees, how it tracks, and how it shoots. But what the Russian commander likely misjudged was this. NATO had already learned from the earlier encounters. The alliance was no longer watching these ships one by one. It was watching them as a network. And that night, the network was ready. What happened that night did not begin in the Bay of Biscay. It began weeks earlier, in colder water, where Russian-linked vessels had been operating in a way that looked commercial on paper, but military in practice. This is one of the central features of Moscow's shadow fleet strategy. Use civilian-looking traffic, auxiliary hulls, and intelligence platforms to build pressure without crossing the clean legal line of declared combat. It is coercion disguised as routine movement, and that makes it dangerous, because the real objective is not always physical damage. Sometimes the goal is to study behavior. How close can a vessel approach before being challenged? How quickly will a NATO ship shift posture? Which sensors come online first? Who hesitates? Who asks permission? Who acts? That earlier British incident mattered for exactly that reason. A directed energy harassment event against a NATO warship was not just intimidation, it was reconnaissance by provocation. Think of it like tapping a building's walls to find the hollow spots before trying to break in. The purpose is not spectacle. The purpose is to map reactions. Russian planners likely concluded that the alliance still had a timing problem. That assumption was understandable but wrong, because Western naval forces do not need to respond loudly to learn quickly. A ship can absorb a provocation, log the emission profile, compare it across allied databases, and quietly rewrite the next encounter before the other side realizes the test has already failed. That is one of the least appreciated strengths of modern NATO maritime operations. Information gained in one theater can alter tactics in another almost immediately. So by the time the Russian vessel launched its drone near the French carrier group, the incident was no longer being judged on its own. It was being read as the next move in an established sequence. And sequences are easier to punish than surprises. That is the deeper mistake Russia appears to have made. They may have believed they were creating uncertainty. In reality, they were creating a pattern. And once a pattern becomes visible, it becomes targetable. By the time that drone came off the Russian deck, the most important decision had probably already been made. Not on the French carrier, on the American destroyer. That matters because most people still imagine naval combat as a ship seeing a threat, switching on a radar, locking it up, and firing in one smooth sequence. In reality, modern fleet defense is much less linear. The ship that shoots does not have to be the ship that sees first. The platform that tracks does not have to be the one most at risk. And the commander making the call may be working from a stitched-together picture built from multiple sensors spread across sea, air, and space. That is where the Russian move began to unravel. The logic behind launching a small drone toward a carrier group is easy to understand. A cheap unmanned aircraft can do more than threaten a deck. It can force reactions, turn on a fire control radar, and you expose part of your electronic fingerprint. Shift formation and you reveal defensive priorities. Launch aircraft and you show what you value most. A low-cost drone can function like a burglar pulling a fire alarm just to see which doors open first. But that only works if the defender reacts the old way, and NATO no longer has to. Instead of flooding the sky with its own emissions, a destroyer can now build a firing picture passively, using signals already present in the environment. Commercial broadcasts, satellite downlinks, civilian transmissions, reflections from other radars in the area. The physics are complicated, but the concept is simple. You do not always need a flashlight if the whole room is already lit by someone else. And that changed everything. Because the Russian commander may have expected to provoke a visible defensive response from the carrier group. What he may not have anticipated was a layered NATO architecture designed specifically to avoid giving away more than necessary. French sensors could contribute tracking. An American combat system could fuse the data. A weapons release authority on another platform could act before the target ever got close enough to force a panicked reaction. That is one of the most important lessons in modern naval warfare. The side with the biggest missile is dangerous. The side with the fastest decision loop is usually deadlier. When the track tightened, the encounter stopped being theoretical. Inside a combat information center, 18 seconds is not time. It is pressure compressed into a human decision. There's no room for elegant debate. No one is giving a speech about international law. No one is calmly reviewing every possibility. Officers are looking at speed, angle, profile, closure rate, intent indicators, and the location of the most vulnerable assets in the formation. And on a carrier, vulnerability is not always where outsiders think it is. People imagine the carrier itself as the only target that matters. That is too simplistic. A flight deck loaded with aircraft, fuel lines, munitions handling, and tightly choreographed launch activity is its own ecosystem. Disrupt that ecosystem even briefly, and you can damage combat power without ever threatening to sink the ship. It is like hitting an airport's runway instead of the terminal. The building may survive. Operations do not. That is why a small drone can create a disproportionately large problem. Even a modest unmanned aircraft forces defenders to make ugly calculations. Is it armed? Is it decoying for something larger? Is it collecting emissions? Is it trying to draw one ship into radiating so another platform farther away can record the signal? In modern maritime confrontations, a single drone can be scout, trigger, distraction, and weapon all at once. That's where the real danger was. If the French carrier had responded alone and conventionally, Russia might have gotten exactly what it wanted. A clean read on NATO radar behavior under pressure. Which systems activate first? Which frequencies spike? How quickly targeting logic shifts from watch to engagement. That kind of intelligence is gold in a future fight. You can train jammers against it. You can shape missile approach paths around it. You can build an electronic ambush from it. So the decision was not merely whether to shoot. The decision was how to shoot without giving the larger game away. That is a much harder problem, and it explains why the response had to be joint, disciplined, and almost clinical. This was no longer about knocking one drone out of the sky. It was about denying Russia the data harvest it had likely come to collect. The cleanest defense in modern warfare is not always the loudest one. At the critical moment, the alliance appears to have solved the problem the way the best naval forces try to solve everything now, by separating sensing, deciding, and shooting across multiple platforms so the enemy never gets a full picture of how the response actually worked. That is the heart of a kill web. Not a single ship fighting alone, but a distributed combat system where one platform detects, another classifies, another contributes tracking, and a fourth may be in position to fire. To an outsider, it can look almost effortless. In reality, it is brutally difficult. Timing has to match. Data quality has to hold. Commanders have to trust inputs that did not originate on their own ship. And the rules of engagement have to support speed without collapsing into chaos. When it works, though, it is devastating. Because the attacker ends up confronting something that behaves less like a formation and more like a nervous system. That may be what happened here. Instead of allowing the Russian launch to force a dramatic radar response from the most politically valuable ship in the group, NATO could answer with a lower signature, networked intercept chain. The drone still dies. The threat is still removed. But the Russian side learns far less than it expected. It came looking for a technical confession and got a closed door. And that changed the balance of the encounter. A missile interception under those conditions is not just a defensive act. It is a message about process. It tells the other side, we can kill the threat without playing the script you wrote for us. We do not have to react on your terms. We do not have to expose every sensor to stop a cheap platform, and we do not need the closest ship to be the one that pulls the trigger. That last point matters more than most people realize, because Russia's hybrid naval tactics often rely on forcing local reactions, pressure the nearest ship, complicate the nearest commander's timeline, turn a tactical nuisance into a political incident. But if the actual response can come from somewhere else in the network, that method starts to collapse. The trap no longer belongs to the provocateur. It belongs to the side with the better architecture. Destroying the drone was the tactical act everyone would notice. What mattered more was what came immediately after. In gray zone naval competition, the first exchange is often not the main event. It is the doorway into the next phase. Once the inbound platform was neutralized, the question changed from defense to dominance. Could NATO stop the immediate threat? Yes. But could it also impose enough pressure to make the Russian vessel understand that the entire game board had shifted? That was the real test. Because surveillance ships, auxiliary hulls, and Shadow Fleet assets operate on a basic assumption. They can stay just below the level of punishment. Not harmless, but not punishable enough. Annoying, ambiguous, deniable, that operating model depends on surviving the encounter with your sensors, your communications, and your confidence intact. Take those away, and the mission is over even if the hull is still afloat. That's why electronic attack matters so much in modern naval standoffs. Jamming is often misunderstood as background noise. It is much more than that. Done properly, it is like forcing an enemy to fight while blindfolded, wearing ear protection and reading the battle through a broken map. A ship may still be physically present, but its ability to collect, coordinate, and report starts collapsing almost immediately. And once that begins, panic follows fast. If the Russian commander expected a narrow exchange centered on the drone, he likely misread the escalation ladder. NATO's answer was not simply, "We saw your move." It was, "We see the entire structure behind your move." That distinction is enormous. One is a local defensive success. The other is strategic exposure. This is where Russia's second bad assumption appears to have failed. They seem to have counted on fragmentation. Different flags, different chains of command, different political thresholds. But a modern NATO maritime response does not need every ally to act identically. It only needs them to contribute pieces of the same picture. One navy logs the tactic, another refines the sensor library, a third positions the shooter. That is not symbolism, that is combat design. And once a coalition starts operating that way, harassment gets expensive very quickly. Because now, every small provocation risks triggering a response bigger than the ship that started it. By sunrise, the most important thing in the battle space was not the wreckage of a drone. It was the collapse of an assumption. For years, Russia's Shadow Fleet logic has depended on the belief that the West would struggle to convert detection into action. Too many lawyers, too many capitals, too many flags on the water, too much hesitation between provocation and response. That belief shaped an entire style of maritime competition built on deniable pressure, civilian cover, electronic probing, and carefully measured escalation. This encounter suggests that assumption is becoming obsolete, because what Russia appears to have run into was not just a French carrier group, or just an American destroyer, or just the memory of an earlier British incident. It ran into a network that had already connected those events into one operational storyline. Once that happened, the drone launch was no longer a local stunt. It became the confirming move in a larger pattern of behavior. And patterns are easier to defeat than surprises. That is the real implication here. Modern naval power is no longer only about who has the larger fleet or the longer missile range. It is about who can compress detection, interpretation, decision, and response into the shortest span of time without losing control. Think of two chess players, except one still pauses between moves to wait for instructions while the other has already anticipated the next three positions. The pieces matter, but tempo decides the board. That's what this encounter exposed. Russia may still have dangerous submarines, capable missiles, and a talent for coercive ambiguity. None of that should be underestimated. But ambiguity stops working once the other side has cataloged your habits, shared them across the alliance, and built a response architecture around them. At that point, the gray zone starts to shrink. And that changed everything. Because the final lesson was not that NATO can shoot down a drone. Plenty of navies can do that. The lesson was that NATO can absorb a provocation, deny the intelligence gained behind it, and then push the aggressor into a position where the next move becomes far riskier than the first. That is how maritime dominance really looks in the modern era. Not loud, not theatrical, just fast, integrated, and mercilessly clear.